Okay. All right, let's get started. So my name's Derek, and this is Getting Started with AWS for VMware Professionals. I'm a principal product manager on the Amazon EC2 team, and I work with a lot of our VMware-related products, including the vCenter plugin that we offer, the VM import tool. And so I've worked with a number of customers that are coming from a more traditional VMware environment and are getting started with AWS. And we're going to talk about some of the subjects that typically come up there. We're going to talk about getting set up to start using AWS when you're operating in that type of environment. We're going to talk about migration a fair bit. That's an item that tends to come up a lot with customers in this position. And we're going to talk about hybrid management a little bit, and then we'll finish up with a couple of tools and resources that you may be interested in afterward. In terms of getting started with AWS, we're going to talk about a couple of key items here. So we'll talk about, first of all, some of the prerequisites, what you should do to basically familiarize yourself with AWS. We'll talk about that very briefly because this is an advanced session. And then we'll get into a little bit about what you want to do with networking, identity and access management, and those are two that I know a lot of people are very familiar with. Configuration management is also a very important item. A lot of customers are less aware of the importance of that coming in, and wish that they spent more time thinking about that up front. And then we'll talk about some tools that we offer that may be relevant for you. So first of all, we're assuming this is an advanced session, so most of you have used EC2 before, used AWS before. If you have not, what I would recommend actually is go get your own personal AWS account and then go through the EC2 Getting Started guide. Great task there is to try to set up a web server so that it can actually deliver a test page. If you haven't gotten at least that far, a lot of the stuff that comes next may not make too much sense for you. We're not going to spend too much time going over this part, though. There's a lot of other sessions at reInvent that would be leveled appropriately for somebody who's interested in that. I would say also, sometimes I get questions from customers who are, for example, like in a classified context, something like that. The personal account is a really good option because you can do that. It's very easy to work with. You don't have any data there. You can build things, break them. And especially if you're in an enterprise context, you don't have to worry about messing anything up with your company's account. So for networking, you want to start here with VPC. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. If you run an EC2 instance in any new account, you're using VPC. This is pretty different than what you're used to coming from a VMware environment. So you're probably used to vSwitches and distributed virtual switches. VPC is it's a more of a fabric-based service. This is not like you get in a lot of environments. This is not like a virtual switch that you log into and interact with. It's a full at-scale service that you interact with through APIs. So the way that you're going to interact with this is going to be pretty different. Specifically, what you're going to want to do right off the bat, if you're trying to do any sort of migration or hybrid use case, is figure out how you can actually connect your AWS environment to your existing data center where you're running VMware. And for most customers, this is either Direct Connect or VPN. There's other options. You could do it purely over the public internet. That's not a common choice. Direct Connect is typically the preferred option if you have that available to you. Another area you're going to want to learn a little bit about, if you haven't used them before, is security groups. So if you're coming from a VMware environment, you're probably more used to a traditional firewall that sits on the perimeter of your network and allows traffic only at the perimeter. A security group is actually, it's more of a host-based firewall, so it actually sits at the level of the virtual machine or instance and actually allows traffic only at that level. So it functions quite a bit differently. I'll assume a lot of you are probably familiar with that. What we're looking at here is a basic VPC, the way that this is set up, so that you have a little context here. We've got a AWS region here with 2 VPCs in it, and then we have those connected to a virtual private gateway, which is then connected to my customer environment here. You can see that the top subnet there, 10.0.0/24, actually has traffic that it's allowing to go over this gateway to my corporate network. The other subnet does not, so I'm here controlling through route tables which of these networks can actually connect to my corporate network. So for example, if I had a hybrid application, I could run it in subnet 1. It could communicate with my corporate network. If I had something I didn't want to communicate with my corporate network, I could run that in subnet 2. This is all pretty straightforward to configure through VPC. If you're not familiar with this is something you want to set up at the beginning because typically you have to set up these networks before you put instances in them. For most of you, if you're working in any sort of enterprise context, you'll actually have multiple accounts and multiple VPCs, and actually architecting these will be one of the larger tasks that you do as part of your planning phase for how you're going to actually start using AWS. The other area you're going to want to spend a fair bit of time is on identity, and there's actually now 3 services that you'll want to take a look at here. Identity and access management is the one that most of you are probably already familiar with. You can think of this as the stateful identity service. It manages users, groups, roles, policies, all of those types of things. You'll also want to use Amazon STS, and you're going to use that for federating identity into Amazon. And in the typical context, you'd have multiple AWS accounts that you'd be managing, and you'd want to have common identities across all of those accounts. And then also, if you're an enterprise, you'll also probably have a very large number of users who may each have different roles that they act in. And so you'll want to use identity federation for that. Think of STS as the stateless identity service. You can use this to assume sessions either based on SAML, based on web identities. You can actually directly assume credentials through an API call. A lot of different flexibility around how you do that. But in most cases, what you're going to do is manage your policies in IAM and then create sessions in STS to then actually access AWS. And then if you want to bring your directory into AWS, there's the new service, AWS Directory Service, that you'll want to look at as well. Think of that as a way of taking your Active Directory into AWS if you want to use it for things like sign-on into Windows instances and things like that. A couple other things that you'll want to look at here pretty quickly. One feature that you're probably not familiar with coming from a VMware environment that's a great one to use right off the bat is instance profiles. So you can actually, when you launch an EC2 instance, attach an instance profile to it, use that to deliver a role. It's the same as what you would get through STS. And then through the metadata service in that instance, you can actually use those credentials to make API calls. So a common design pattern would be if you have a program or an application that needs to interact with your infrastructure somehow, you can actually deliver an instance profile to that instance, and then it can programmatically use that. The credentials never leave AWS. They're rotated on your behalf. Everything's very easy to use. Different than what you would use elsewhere. In a lot of cases, what you're going to do here is going to play very nicely with vSphere 5.1 and above, where single sign-on was introduced. So I'll show some examples later of what we're doing here. And in those cases, we're using 5.1 specifically for the single sign-on feature so that we can connect vSphere and AWS both back to a common directory on the back end. And this is a brief example of how you might do identity federation. So here we've got a user up at the top here who's then connecting to my identity broker. There's a couple different options for this. You can get this from a vendor if you want. There's a number of folks on the show floor that can provide that for you. A number of customers choose to build their own. The product that I'm going to show you a little bit later has one of these built into it. And essentially what that's doing is it's validating that the customer, that your end user who signs into that is who they say they are. It's performing authentication. And then it's calling out to STS to get a tokenized identity. And then there's basically two options that it can do at that point. It can either give those credentials directly to the user, and they can use them for the CLI access or other tools. They can just copy and paste that and use that. That will be a temporary identifier, so you don't have to worry as much about what happens with that. There's less of a chance of that walking away than a durable credential. And then you also can redirect that user to then log into the console if you want. You can format a special URL in there that will actually log them into the console in the context of the permissions that you granted them. So in an enterprise context, this is the typical way that you do this. It's a little bit different than like a VCD environment that you would normally be used to coming from VMware. But you'll definitely want to set one of these up pretty early on. Once you do this, though, you can give access to EC2 instances, DynamoDB databases, any AWS resource that you want across multiple different accounts if you want as well. So this is a single piece of enterprise infrastructure you're going to want to set up that you'll be able to reuse pretty broadly. The next subject I want to talk about is configuration management. So when I talk to customers who started their move to AWS, a lot of them are very enthusiastic and dive straight into individual services and start building. And then around 6 months, 9 months later, they discover CloudFormation, and they wish they'd known about it earlier. So the networking and identity we talked about, I think most people discover that that's something they're going to have to spend time on. This one's actually not that hard. It's a lot easier than it seems like it would be, and it's one that is well done earlier rather than later. Once the AWS Service Catalog is live, you'll be able to use that too. The Service Catalog is actually built on top of CloudFormation, so anything that you build in CloudFormation today, you'll have an easy path to leverage the Service Catalog in the future. That's the new service that was just announced yesterday that'll be live in 2015. CloudFormation's been live for quite a while, though, and that's available to use now. The reason that you want to use this, you can think of it as a little bit like a template you might use in a VMware context, like you would use in VCD, VCAC, just directly in vCenter, except it's a little bit different in the AWS context because it actually allows you to build templates that span all of the different AWS resources. So we'll see an example in a moment where we're actually combining multiple different AWS resources into a single template. There's also some logic in there to actually manage updates to that template and track drift. And then if you want to do a provider-consumer model, like you might do in VCD, templates would be typically the way that you would do that. You would publish a template and give somebody credentials to then run that, create a stack from that template. So this is something that you want to do pretty early on. The nice thing about this is that it supports all the different services, so you can just set up your templating once, and then if you want to plug in new, you discover all of a sudden that you want to use ELB, you weren't using ELB before. It's just a matter of updating the template, and now you're using ELB, rather than building against each service individually. So this is a brief diagram of how this works. I create a template, I store it either locally or more likely in S3 somewhere, and then I tell CloudFormation to create a stack from it. It goes ahead and does it. I can edit the template, and CloudFormation will then go ahead and update that when I want it to. And as I mentioned, this is great for working with multiple different AWS services. So, if I want, for example, a typical multi-tier application, I can use RDS on the back end for my database. I can use EC2 and auto-scaling for the web servers. I can put an ELB in front of that. Now I've got a whole multi-tier application described in a simple template. And if I want to change something about that, if I want to create another one, that's very easy to do. Especially in an enterprise context, you're probably deploying to a dev test environment, an integ environment, a production environment. You might be doing that in multiple different regions. You might be doing that in multiple different accounts. The template provides a very good way to consistently create that same infrastructure in all those different contexts. So this is also a best practice if you want to, for example, run this template in dev test, make sure that you're happy with it, and then run the template again in production. It's very replicatable as well. So let's do a brief example of how this works. So I'm just going to show you a sample template here, actually. So we're actually in the documentation for CloudFormation here. And we're going to actually run a auto-scaled, load-balanced website in an Amazon VPC. We can actually look at what that template looks like here. And we'll see that this is just it's a YAML file. It's a bit of an eye chart probably for you, but it's from the audience. But it's pretty straightforward, not that hard to get your head around. And very easy to take one of these sample templates and just substitute a couple values for whatever you need. We're going to actually go ahead and run one of these. And you can see here I've got the S3 URL for this template in there. If I created my own template, I could just put my own URL in there. I'm going to run this in two AZs. I'm going to run this in US West B and C. And I'm going to run two. I'm going to do a T2 micro. T2 is a great instance type if you're coming from a VMware context. It's the burstable instance. So if you're used to having oversubscribed CPU in a VMware world, T2 is going to be the most similar instance type for you. It's also the least expensive. So if you're wondering what instance type to start with, I would start with a T2 for the large majority of your VMware-based workloads. And then if that doesn't work, then graduate into a larger instance. Very often in a VMware environment, you'll often find that somebody originally bought a physical host a while ago, created a VM from it, it's got 16 gigs of RAM on it, and only 2 of those are actually being used. And then somebody goes and gets an EC2 instance with 16 gigs of RAM on it, and you're paying a lot more than you need to. So often, as part of moving to AWS, you want to think about sizing it's worth spending at least a little bit of time on. So we're going to go ahead and create this. And you'll see here, I've actually created a couple of these already, but you'll see the new one here. So you can see this creation is in progress. This will take about 3 minutes to create, so I'll actually show you one that's actually already been created here. And you can see we get a full list of the events that are in progress here. It's created my load balancer, my security group. It's created my launch configuration for auto-scaling. It's created auto-scaling itself. If any of these failed to create, so like if I fat-fingered something or I didn't have permissions, it would actually be smart enough to roll back this whole stack for me so I don't have stranded resources lying around. And I can see the different resources associated with it here. I can also see an output associated with it here, which is a URL. I've got that actually pulled up already. You can see we've got a test page here. If we want to run an app, it's that easy. We just launch that stack and we have an app. If we come here, we can also see that I have one here that I updated. So in this case, we're looking at the events here. I ran the stack here, and then I did an update actually to switch it to use T2 small instances. So micro wasn't big enough. I wanted to use the small. This was actually smart enough in this case to terminate, to load balance everything onto one instance, terminate the other, replace it with the next size that I wanted, load balance back onto the instance, terminate the other one, create the new one. And so I never actually lost customer serving traffic during this process. That was all managed by CloudFormation for me. I just went in and typed in a new value, and it took care of everything else. So this is a great way if you want to manage across multiple different AWS services to go ahead and do that. I'd highly suggest that you take a look at that. And you can see pretty different than a template that you might be used to, where you right-click on a VM and create a template from it. So we have a pre-built option here. This is a product I work on. I want to show you a little bit about this, both because it might be interesting to you to use this, and also it's an example of how you can kind of stitch some of this together. There's also a lot of partners that have similar tools, and I'd encourage you to look at those as well. This is the AWS Management Portal for vCenter. It's a plugin that we provide for free. It supports a lot of the basic use cases that you might be interested in when you're first getting started. It includes, it's built for enterprises, so it's got integrated identity federation, role-based access controls. It lets you manage your networking. You can deploy from templates. It's a first-class client of the VM import service, so it makes it really easy to import VMs. And it uses entirely public AWS APIs, so it's not privileged in any way. Anything that you create through here, you can interact with through the AWS CLI, the management console, anything else that you want. And this is really kind of targeted for this type of an audience. It's to help you get started. It doesn't have the full feature set that you would get by using other AWS services directly, but it makes it easy to get up and running with some of the things we just talked about. So in a lot of cases, you might want to start with this, and you might find that you outgrow it over time, but it does hopefully accelerate you in the beginning. So let's look at how this works. So here we are in vCenter 5.1. I assume most of this crowd is familiar with what this looks like. Many of you maybe have not seen this icon before, which is the AWS Management Portal icon. When you install our plugin, this icon will show up. And I click on this, and now I'm looking at my AWS infrastructure from inside of vCenter. And if I want here, I can stop start instances. I can look at monitoring data for this. Interact with this all sorts of different, in all sorts of kind of basic use cases here, similar to what I do in the EC2 console. The one item I want to point out before I get too deep, well, so you can see here, this is CloudWatch monitoring data. This is a test instance, so there's nothing running on here. That's why it's flat lines. It's maybe not as interesting as it could be, but rest assured, this is CloudWatch metrics, so if you had something on here, it would show up and be interesting. I can see the summary data here, so I can see the IP address if I wanted to SSH into this or RDP into this. And then you can see I've got some tags here as well that I've placed on it. If you are interested too, you can also see there's a kind of a subtle item here. I'm actually getting all of this logged in actually as an Active Directory user. So this is a test Active Directory stack that I set up. So I logged into vCenter, clicked on this. I was immediately signed in with the same identity that I'd used for vCenter. So this saves you, if you use this, it saves you from having to set up the identity federation. It's basically bundled in with this. I've got a couple things that I can do here as well. So if I want, I can, I'll create what we call an environment here, which allows you to permission on different things. So I'll create reinvent 2. Create this in my dev test VPC. I'm going to give it access to 2 subnets. I've got this new environment here. I can create a template from it. Create a rel template. So I'm going to do rel 7 here. And I'll do, M3 medium sounds great. I'll do this on a public subnet. I'll give it a public IP address. If I want, I can change the block device mappings here. I don't need to do that in this case. I could create a security group if I wanted. I'm just going to give it a regular SSH security group that I already have set up. I could give it a key pair as well, but I'm not going to. This is actually just going to create a template, so I haven't actually created any resources yet. I've just created this, any instances yet. I've just created this template. And then when I'm ready, I can just click to deploy. One of the things that's kind of cool about this is actually the permissions for this are all here, so I'll give it a name. And it's that easy to deploy an instance from this. So one of the cool things about this is the permissions are all integrated. So as I'd mentioned that the identity was integrated, we have also done the permissioning as well. So I can just right-click on this environment if I want. And I have a series of roles available to me, just like I would in vCenter. And I can pick, actually, somebody from either, we'll see this in a second when it comes up, either my Active Directory or my vCenter system domain. Pick a user. I'll use Atul here. And give them read-only access to this. And so it's very easy to manage these permissions. I can go in here and verify that, yes, that tool has read-only access. I'm set up as an administrator, so I have access to this as well. I can see the instances that are running in here, summary information, and so on. I also have a VPC tab here where I can manage all of my networking. In the interest of time, I won't show you this, but suffice it to say I can create VPCs, subnets. It's checkbox. It's pretty straightforward to do. It masks some of the complexity so that you have seen elsewhere. So I showed you those route tables, for example. We don't expose that in this tool. It's more of a getting started tool. If you need to modify that, you can go into the AWS Management Console and modify that there. So let's talk about migration. This is actually something that I think a lot of customers that are using VMware are talking about, whether it's all or part or an app or something, they want to understand a little bit more about how they should do migration. It turns out to be a little bit more complex subject than I think a lot of people appreciate until they start doing it. So in terms of planning, there's one very obvious first step that I would suggest to pretty much all of you that are thinking about a migration, and that's to take your image catalog, your golden images, whatever the corporate approved RHEL image, Win 2012 image, whatever it is that you use as the basis for building all of your other images from. Take that and import that first, so that any developers, anybody who wants to do net new applications, has this catalog to start with. If you have a intrusion detection software, whatever it might be that you want installed. Focus on getting them a good, clean image in EC2 to start with as a first step before migrating your existing applications. In a lot of cases, a lot of customers, net new applications are going to be one of the first things that you want to do on AWS, so this will sort out naturally. This also happens to be very easy for you, and it unblocks a lot of stuff. It's a good way to learn. From there, a lot of customers will next move into building a prioritized set of workloads. This could be driven by a couple things. Andy mentioned a couple of these in the keynote yesterday. Constrained data center is a big one. So I'm running out of space. I don't want to buy any more. So I don't necessarily care what the workload is. I just want to get something out of there so I don't have to expand that footprint. It could be that I have some new development effort or a new feature that I want to capture that's going to be better served on AWS, so I want to position my application to take advantage of that. It could be TCO driven. It could be driven by any number of other things. And then, once you have this prioritized list of applications, you want to start thinking about sorting them into move groups. And this is a concept that a lot of tools have as a first-class object. If you work with ISVs, system integrators, you've probably heard about this idea. A lot of these applications will have common dependencies. So you'll have a couple of app servers that use the same database. It makes sense to move those together, so you'll want to sort those so that you can do that. And then you also want to think about your strategy for those individual applications. So some applications you may just want to lift and shift. It's a black box. It's not worth the effort of digging into that, figuring out what's going on. Other ones may be very important to you, and there may be features that you're looking to take advantage of on AWS, and you may actually want to do a little bit of redevelopment. So you'll actually want to split those apart into different streams depending on what strategy you're going to use. As an example, the tools that you may want to use will vary a fair bit depending on what the actual application is that you're trying to move. So if it is that black box that you don't want to touch, our VM import service or any number of partner tools can do just a black box migration for that. They just convert it into an EC2 instance. Any old drivers that you had in there are still in there. It's basically what you had before, just running on EC2, appropriate for a pretty broad class of VMs. I would not do that for a database, though. So if you have a database, databases have great tools. I'm always surprised that people try to do VM migrations for databases. Instead, set up a database on EC2 that's the same version and then just replicate to it and then do a failover. Much smoother, much easier to manage than doing a black box migration for that. Same thing can be true for kind of any class of workload where there's a good segregation between the data and the operating system. So like a CMS is often very much the same story. And then if you have a very large volume of data, Direct Connect can help a lot with that. But if it's a very large amount, we also have a lot of customers who will ship hard drives using the AWS import service. So you may want to check that out as well. And then this is actually a very active space for partners. And we'll talk about partners a little bit more when we talk about the team. But there's a lot of people on the show floor who have some great tools here. AWS provides some basic ones, but there's a lot of partners that have specialized in individual workloads. So if you have an Oracle database, there's actually people who do entire practices just on migrating Oracle or just on migrating SAP, and you may be well served to try to meet some of those people. Also build a test plan and then plan to iterate. So in terms of your migration team, so first thing I would say is your team is not just going to be inside of your own organization if you're doing a large migration. Now, if you're doing 1-2 applications, that may be fine. A lot of customers we work with are doing thousands. And if you're in that scale, you'll definitely want to think about working with AWS support, that's going to be a great lifeline to have if you get in trouble at the last minute on some application. You also want to think about working with partners quite a bit. So you'll be going through the migration for the first time. These will all be new tools to you. They have a lot of sharp edges. You want to be careful about kind of who you work with on what. There's a lot of partners out there that do pretty much just migration for their practice. They wake up in the morning, they migrate some applications, they go to bed, they get up the next day, do the same thing. They've been doing it for quite a while. Working with them can flatten the learning curve quite a bit. And this includes ISVs, system integrators, consultants, kind of across the board. There's actually a pretty large chunk of folks at the show floor and re:Invent that specialize just in this. And depending on how you work with them, it can be actually a pretty reasonable engagement for you, especially when you're first getting started to work with some of those partners. The way that, so we also have a professional services team that can help with this, and they actually have a dedicated migration practice that just does migrations as well. In terms of organizing the team within your organization, usually the model that I've seen is most successful is to have a core migration team that basically is a heavy team that just focuses on offering this as a service in your organization. And then depending on the way that you're organized, they may either push or support the application owners to actually migrate, depending on who's leading who in your organization. Pretty much every group that I've seen that's done this successfully has used agile planning. So they set goals that are only a week or two out to begin with, and they hit those and then they iterate. The waterfall plan for migrating 1,000 applications when you haven't done this before is unlikely to be nearly as productive as the agile. And then you also want to have a little bit of a diversity on this team as well. So you definitely need some cloud advocates, some folks who are passionate about how your VPCs are going to be organized, or passionate about how you want to set up your AWS environment, and which applications you want there, and how you want them architected. You also want to have some of your VMware and IT folks who are very familiar with how these applications run today and why they run that way on that team as well. And then, of course, some executive sponsorship never hurt. In terms of setting up the infrastructure, the biggest mistake that I see a lot of customers make is that they assume that they assume it's a one-time thing, and often it ends up being more of an ongoing process. So I actually had a customer I talked to just yesterday, and we're asking them, how long do you think you're going to keep your migration team up and running? And they said, well, it won't be a full team all the time. We'll kind of spin it up and spin it down, but we expect to be acquiring companies for the foreseeable future, and pretty much any of them that aren't on AWS will need to be migrated to AWS. So we need this infrastructure around so that next time we buy a company, we have a process to run them through. And actually, a lot of customers also reuse this so that this becomes a generalized application onboarding framework, right? You have a certain checklist you have to go through to complete the migration in terms of security, in terms of operational performance, all the other things that you want to check for. It turns out that's actually very reusable as a process for onboarding net new applications as well. So think about reusing it that way. Documentation, of course, is great. And as with many things that you develop, script that you write once, you're probably going to reuse. So a lot of teams discover this maybe a little bit later than they'd like. Just think about having like a wiki or a repository or something where you're going to just kind of stash those things so that you have some way to start collecting those over time. And again, the heavy team helps with that naturally as well. So let's do a migration. So I'm going to, I told you this tool supported migration, so I will show you how that works. We're going to go into our host and clusters view here, which will be, I'm sure, familiar for many people in this room. And let's take our golden CentOS image here. And when we have the plugin installed, we can right-click on this and we get this new option, Migrate to EC2. I'm going to select that. We're going to migrate this as a Linux instance. Let's go to our new environment. We'll go to the private subnet. An M3 medium sounds fine. I'll do an SSH security group. If I wanted to give it a specific IP address, I could. And I click migrate, and now this is going to start the migration process. This is actually runs headless. The plugin is set up so that I can actually shut my laptop, go home for the day, and check back in the morning, and this will all be completed. So this is actually a great tool for migration just for that reason alone. The team that builds this is also a sister team of the VM import team that builds the underlying service. So it's a first-class citizen here. And I can see that this is running. If I want, I can go look at my tasks here, and I can see that there's an OVF export that's in progress. That's the first step of the migration process. And then I can also go over to my plugin, and I can, I'm going to go back to the dashboard. We'll see that there's the in-progress import there, and then we can also go up here and track the progress. So I'm on this VM to EC2 migrations tab. We can see it's waiting to upload. I could follow the progress of this here, and I can queue up a bunch of these migrations. So it's pretty straightforward to do through this tool. There's other tools available, obviously. There's some partners that have some great tools here as well. This is merely intended to be exemplary for how you can go about doing that. But it doesn't have to be all that hard necessarily to do that migration. A couple of case studies, if you're interested in customers who've done some large-scale migrations. I would look at Condé Nast and Suncorp, and on our case studies page, we have some videos from them. This is a little bit more geared to maybe like an IT leadership view and change agent for how they're thinking about migrations. But both of these customers have done some pretty significant migrations using processes similar to what we just described. So let's talk about hybrid management. This is a very hot topic. First of all, let's talk about some considerations for hybrid, because I want to make it clear what exactly I'm talking about, because there's a lot of different ways that people talk about this. And then I'll go through some architectures that I've seen that are particularly interesting. So in terms of hybrid architectures, you see a lot of customers that operate more than one environment. They have AWS, and then they have a VMware environment or something else. That's very common, and a lot of customers who are looking for hybrid management are often looking to manage those types of applications together. I'm sure most of you fall into that category. We hear a lot sometimes about customers talking about hybrid applications. Those are much more rare. I'll talk a little bit about how you might go about doing one of those. But an actual application that's served by two or more very different environments is much more rare. But we'll still talk about it. But generally, keeping your application coherent is going to be the easiest way of doing this. One of the biggest headaches that a lot of people that I've seen run into when they're trying to hybridize an application is that the security of the application actually doesn't anticipate this. So for example, you've got a database, and you've got a series of applications that all connect to that database. Turns out maybe they're not using SSL, maybe they're using a shared password, maybe that's the root password, or maybe they're not even authenticated. It's actually quite common in a lot of organizations that there was a crunchy on the outside, GUI on the middle security model that nobody really intended to have, but sort of ended up that way. And it probably shouldn't be that way on premises, but especially, you see a lot of CTO, CSO, CIO that want to use migration or hybridization as a forcing function to fix some of these historical bad practices. And a lot of times customers end up discovering these things when they actually do their application discovery, and this blocks hybridizing these applications. And so typically you have to do some amount of redevelopment to kind of prepare the application for that migration. The best way to do that is to wrap it into services. So we'll talk about that in one of these examples. But the service-oriented architecture is a much more natural architecture for hybridizing the application. So you can have, if the database is wrapped in a service and the application is wrapped in a service, and they're able to communicate over the public internet or across an untrusted channel of some sort, or across a channel that might be partitioned or might have latency issues, whatever it might be, that architecture is going to be much more resilient for that. So you can definitely build it. It's hard to hybridize an existing application, though, for those reasons. If you're thinking about this, we've already covered most of the things that you need to set up. So you need to look at you need to plan your network for this. You're going to have to do some of the route table work that we talked about. Probably want direct connect or a VPN connection of some sort. If you're looking for consistent performance here, direct connect is going to be your best option, because you've got bandwidth that's just dedicated to you. And it's a private link, so you always get that bandwidth. There's a lot fewer failure modes to deal with there. And then you want to use identity federation as well, so you can have a common identity in both environments. Some things that you may want depending on your use case, but I would recommend waiting to do until you discover that you actually need them, is a common image catalog between both environments. So, for example, we talked about moving your golden CentOS image over. You can set up infrastructure that you always have the same image in both places, and you can deploy the same VM in both cases. It's a bit of work to do that, and a lot of customers maybe think that they want to do that up front, and it ends up being less relevant over time. So that one you might want to wait to do. The same thing with data replication, monitoring. A lot of these things actually, there's kind of a VMware way of doing it, and there's kind of an AWS way of doing it. Often you're happiest if you stick with the semantics of each side when you're working there. So use VMware's monitoring when you're working with VMware, use AWS's monitoring when you're working with AWS. If you have a reason that you need to marry those two and have a common solution, bite the bullet at that point. But often sticking within the semantics of the platform you're using gives you richer access to their features, and it's a more integrated experience. So one sample hybrid architecture I want to talk about is actually the plugin we just showed you. So this is a project I just worked on. And you can see here the way that this actually works. We've got a, there we are. We've got the vSphere, the vCenter server here that you're managing. You've got a vCenter client that's on the same network. And as part of installing the plugin, you actually install a virtual machine here that we provide, which is a FreeBSD 10-based virtual machine. And that includes the logic for managing the VM import, and it includes a federation proxy. So that when you actually go to use the plugin, that handles getting an STS token for you, and it connects back to the management portal service and actually delivers that as an experience inside of your data center. And then, of course, gives you access to other Amazon features there as well. So, with the federation proxy, we talked about that as something you might want to set up. We didn't invent this architecture. This is actually something we saw a lot of customers building on their own for their own types of solutions, and so we simply came up with an option that you could just install that would provide a lot of this for you. But this looks very much like what a typical identity federation solution might look like if you build one of those. Let's do a little bit more advanced one. This is one that I've been seeing recently that I think is actually really cool. So here we've got something a little bit more built out. Again, we have our own data center that's running vSphere hosts. We also threw some physical hosts in here. And then we're using Direct Connect to connect that to the AWS cloud. We've got the management portal and STS service in there that we're using for part of this. We don't have to use that. We don't have to use the management portal if we don't want. That's optional. But we're using STS for identity federation. And then the really cool part that we're doing here is all of our clients live out here on the network. We've got mobile clients, PC clients, and they're actually connecting in through workspaces here. And we're actually, in this architecture, we actually run the vSphere client on a workspaces client. So you actually can come in, you have your MFA login, you're on your iPad even, because it doesn't matter because you're not actually storing anything on the device. And you log into the workspaces client, and then you're using that to actually connect back into your data center. So in this case, the data center actually doesn't have any direct egress or ingress to the network. You're actually doing all of that through workspaces and then over Direct Connect. We've also got a series of VPCs here. We've got one of those VPCs that's internet accessible. We've got a peering to another VPC. You can really build this out. But the part here that I think is actually really cool is combining this hybrid architecture with the workspaces client. That could just as well be a jump box or like a Linux box, that, for example, that you set up, but some sort of common entry point for both environments, and then using Direct Connect to access both environments on the back end. The fact that it's workspaces means that you don't have to deal with managing any of the desktop as you get desktop as a service. You don't have to manage that yourself. You don't have to worry about that bandwidth. You don't have to worry about administering that. And it's quite secure, so it's a great option for that. So in summary, no direct access to the internet, using Direct Connect between the two environments. We can use BYOD in that type of context. We're using VPC peering within the region, VPN across the regions. We have single sign-on in that context because we're using STS for that. We have a full range of AWS services that we can access. We're managing both physical hosts and VMware hosts from that workspace in that case. And then we can layer on any partner tools that we need on top of that. So that's a great option. And then, finally, at the end here, when we do see hybrid applications, usually the model that it's following is that there's some AWS capability that an on-premises application wants that's difficult to deliver on-premises, but pretty easy to consume from AWS. Interestingly, there's not a ton of these, but one that I've seen actually used quite a bit is actually SQS, the simple queuing service, for the reason that I can take an on-premise application, make an API call out to SQS, put something on a queue in the AWS cloud, and then I can have an EC2 instance running in AWS, pick that item off the queue, and work it. And now I've got an application that's running in both environments. And there, if I have a network partition, if I have any of these other sorts of failure modes, it's pretty resilient to that. And the queuing makes it very natural to work in that sort of a distributed context. It's not limited to SQS, though. You can do that with S3 and other services as well. You also see a couple specific use cases that end up driving some of this. So you want to have, for example, all of your logs get shipped to one place, all your monitoring data get shipped to one place. So you, for example, can install a CloudWatch agent in your on-premises VMs and then ship monitoring data out to AWS and look at it in CloudWatch, for example. So a lot of times these sorts of hybrid applications that we do see, it's much more tactical. It's not necessarily something that was designed to be that way. And I'm sure a lot of these folks, if they build it from scratch, would probably not have built it as a hybrid application. But for one reason or another, they're committed to operating in multiple different environments, and they're trying to do kind of a best of both worlds solution here. And as we mentioned with a hybrid application, it's a service-oriented architecture, so it's designed to work this way. Finally, in closing, some tools and resources that you may find interesting. So the management portal we talked about, all the other services, we've got documentation, all that. I'm sure you can find that. I would also plug again the partners. I've seen customers in this space be much, much more successful when they work with partners, and there's quite a few that work on this space. So if you want to identify any of our partners, you can go to that URL, and then also on the showroom floor, there's quite a few of them down there. So we've got about 4 minutes at the end here. I'll actually probably just plan on taking questions on the side if anybody has any. But hopefully you've enjoyed the session, and I would love to get your feedback on what was helpful, what was not helpful. If any of you use these tools, they have feedback buttons everywhere. Just let us know what you would like to see, and that drives all of our roadmaps, so we're very eager to hear about that. Thank you very much.